Hello and welcome to the We're Not Experts History podcast with Sarah and James. Now, today we're talking about the Great British Summertime, specifically the summer of 1976. Now, if you ask anyone who was around then what they remember, they'll probably tell you about brown lawns, endless sunshine, hosepipe bands, and children playing outside until late into the evening. For many, it was the summer that seemed to last forever.
Yeah, there's a lot of nostalgia surrounding it. Obviously, I don't remember it, but I
No,
have heard
we
many
weren't here
stories
then.
about it. Sorry? No, exactly. But behind the fond memories you mentioned, there was a genuine national emergency. The reservoirs were running dry, crops were failing, and the country was facing one of the worst droughts in its modern history.
Yes, that is true. And the summer of 1976 did go down in history as Britain's hottest summer ever. And it's become almost legendary, with every hot spell ever since being compared to that summer.
Yes, but was it really the hottest? And what
Mm.
actually made that summer so extraordinary? Was it just simply the temperatures, or was there much more to the story?
Well, that is what we'll be doing in this podcast. We'll be taking a look back at the remarkable events of 1976 to explore how this ordinary British summer turned into a national crisis and discover why not even nearly, it's exactly 50 years later,
Years, yeah.
people are still talking about it.
Yeah, so I'm going to go and find myself a cold drink. I don't think I've got any ice cream. I'm going to sit in a shady spot while everyone else listens into us as we travel back to one of the most unforgettable summers the country has ever experienced.
Okay, so before we dive into the actual heatwave itself, let's rewind the clock and we'll take a look at Britain in the mid 1970s. So it wasn't that long ago in the grand scheme of things, but life was still very different from today.
Yeah, well, for a start, the music was far better.
Yes, I have
There
to
was
agree.
Oh yeah, it's not just different times, almost a different world. So you had no
Hmm.
internet, no smartphones. And if you
Mm.
wanted to know what the weather was going to do, you couldn't just look at your phone, check your app. You'd have
No,
to watch the TV, listen to the radio. I don't know, probably was in the newspaper, or the easiest way was just to look out the window.
yeah. And when it came to keeping cool, people didn't really have many options. I mean, air conditioning was incredibly rare in Britain. You wouldn't have found it in most homes. Very few public buildings had it, and it definitely wasn't something you'd find in the average family car.
Also, weather forecasting wasn't nearly as sophisticated either. So
No,
your meteorologists could spot the big picture, but they didn't have the powerful computer models and satellite technology that we take for granted today.
no,
So while they knew that the country was heading for this heat wave, nobody quite realised just how extraordinary that summer would become.
no. But here's something that's often forgotten. The story of the 1976 heatwave didn't actually begin in the summer at all. It began quite a bit earlier.
Yes, the winter of 1975 coming into 1976 had been unusually dry,
That's
whereas
right.
normally that's when your reservoirs, your rivers, and groundwater supplies are replenished after the previous summer. But that winter simply didn't deliver anything like enough rain.
No. So by the time springs arrive, water levels are already lower than they should have been. And nobody knew this yet, but Britain was heading into one of the hottest, driest summers in living memory, with far less water in reserve than they would normally have. So not a good start.
Terrible.
So let's talk about the heat wave. We'll take it month by month. So
Yeah.
although this drought had been quietly developing over the winter, it wasn't until late spring that people really started to notice the weather changing.
And at first, nobody was complaining. After
No,
all, it's Britain. The sun comes out so rarely, apparently, if you I speak to some people. But,
yeah,
people were enjoying the fact that it was bright and it was warm. You could get a tan.
yeah. And as we moved into May, the country started to warm up. So it wasn't unbearably hot, a bit like the May that we experience most summers. It's pleasant. It's not too hot. It's just pleasant. So you've got parks filled with people enjoying the sunshine. Gardens are at their best. For most people, it just felt like Britain was finally having a decent summer.
Yes, there was also no reason, absolutely no reason whatsoever, to think anything unusual was about to happen.
No. And then June arrives. So this is May. Then
Yeah.
June arrives. Things begin to change at this point. So the temperatures started to climb. But the most important thing is that the rain just didn't come. Days turned into weeks of almost uninterrupted sunshine, which sounds great, but of course the ground is becoming drier and drier.
Yeah, yes, and that's really the key to it. It wasn't just that it was hot; it stayed hot, and there
Mm.
was very little chance of the countryside, anywhere to recover.
No. And by July, it starts to become apparent that this wasn't just another warm summer. Temperatures are regularly climbing above 30 degrees Celsius, which was quite unheard of in Britain during the 1970s.
Yuck! I'm not a fan of the heat, and this is
No,
making me get me uncomfortable.
yeah,
So back to 1976, the people's lawns were starting to turn brown. Your rivers were shrinking, reservoirs were dropping, and suddenly the newspapers had a much bigger story on their hands, more so than your simple reporting of another sunny day.
yeah, exactly. And what started as a welcome summer or welcome summer weather, it was beginning to look like something much more serious.
And then came August, and
August, yeah,
that's really when the country began to feel this strain. So
yeah,
water shortages were becoming impossible to ignore. Farmers were struggling as crops failed and livestock suffered in the heat,
yeah.
and hospitals were seeing more people affected by heat exhaustion.
Yeah. And it was around this time that many start again. It was around this time that many areas introduced hosepipe bans, but we'll come
Uh,
back to that because that does become one of the defining features of this summer.
So by now, what had started as this a beautiful summer that people are really enjoying, it developed into a full blown national crisis.
Yeah, exactly. So we've looked at how the heat wave has unfolded, but what was it actually like to live through those extraordinary weeks? Now, we've got some idea at the moment because we're just, well, at the time of recording this, we're just off the back of a heat wave. But obviously, we're
With
now
another
in
one coming, yeah.
2026. There is another one coming next week. But we're in 2026. This was 1976. So very different. And obviously, since then, Britain has become far more accustomed to periods of extreme heat.
That's true. Um,
Mm.
but the big good difference is that today we've adapted. Lots of people have air conditioning in their cars, as you said before. Offices are better ventilated. Supermarkets are full of bottled water and big freezer sections, which I really enjoy in August. And we
Yeah,
receive the
set up
regular
camp.
heat health warnings telling us exactly what to do. I have it on my phone. When there's a weather warning, I get an alert.
Yeah, same. And but back in 1976, very little of that existed. So most homes had no way
Mm.
of cooling down. Air conditioning was pretty much unheard of. And after weeks of relentless sunshine, there was another problem making life even more difficult. Now, can you guess what that was?
Well, the obvious answer is there wasn't enough water.
Exactly. This drought
Yeah.
became just as significant as the heat itself, and the government eventually were forced to introduce emergency powers through the Drought Act of 1976, and this allowed water authorities to impose restrictions across much of the country.
And that's where the famous hosepipe ban came from.
Yeah. And on top of that, they were asked not to wash their cars. Watering
When
gardens became heavily restricted, and everyone was encouraged to conserve as much water as possible. Now, this might sound fairly normal today, but at the time it was something that Britain had never experienced on such a scale.
And while most of us might have been worrying about keeping the lawn green, farmers had much bigger problems.
Yes, let's not forget the farmers in all of this. The warning signs for them had actually appeared months earlier, and as far back as April, Farmers Weekly was already reporting that reservoirs were running dangerously low, and the Ministry of Agriculture warned both arable and livestock farmers to prepare for water shortages. I can never pronounce that word. Later in the year.
Yeah, you did manage to pronounce it first time. But the warnings that the Ministry of Agriculture had put out worryingly proved to be well founded.
Yeah, unfortunately, yes. Across the country, crops were failing as the ground baked under weeks of relentless sunshine, and the grass stopped growing, so it became very difficult to feed livestock. And at the same time, rivers, ponds, and other water supplies were continuing to shrink.
And also, then comes another danger that many people don't associate with the summer of 76, fire.
Yes, indeed. The countryside became so dry that suddenly there's these huge crop and grass fires breaking out. And just as one example, a farm in Suffolk lost more than 900 acres of crops. That is a
Wow.
huge amount in
Colossal amount,
one
yeah.
single blaze. I mean, can you imagine how devastating that would have been for the farmers involved?
Terrible. And
Yeah.
then, just to add insult to injury, when the rain finally arrived,
The ground became so hard that we had floods. The water
brilliant.
basically just ran straight off the surface instead of soaking in. So we had a lot of flash flooding, and because the fields were so waterlogged, the farmers couldn't harvest what was there. It just basically rotted into the ground, which is why we had massive loss of crops during this time.
Yeah. And for everyone else, though, it's often the little memories that have stayed with them over the years.
Yeah, I mean, like we said, this was before our time, but if you ask somebody that was around then, they will remember the tarmac melting in the roads, railway tracks expanding in the heat, the fact that fans were selling out in shops, ice cream vans were doing a roaring trade, they probably sold out as well, beaches being packed with holidaymakers, um, swimming pools overflowing with people desperately trying to cool off. You can just imagine it.
Yeah, so I'm still surprised there used to be tarmac on the roads. So very little of it now.
Yeah, now it's just
So
potholes.
yeah, so 1976 really was a summer of extremes. It was
Mm,
not wonderful memories for some, but incredibly difficult for others.
yes, and I can relate to a small past fact because I drive a classic car, as you know, and I tell you what, during this heat wave that we're experiencing, it's been quite. So this is my first summer of having my classic car, and it has been quite an education having to drive around with no aircon in the car. I can't remember the last time I had a car that did not have aircon, and it yeah, it makes me appreciate how uncomfortable everyday journeys would have been back in 1976 when most cars would not have had aircon. It's a bit of an eye opener, I'll tell you that.
Yeah. Well, then they had no choice. For you, it's
No,
self-inflicted.
it
But
is, yes.
at least you can remind yourself that it could be worse, and you could also be under a hosepipe ban.
Yeah, exactly. But jokes aside, when you put all of those things together, so you've got the relentless heat, the drought, the impact on farming, the fires, the water shortage, you begin to understand why people are still talking about the summer of 1976, 50 years on.
Of course, yeah, it wasn't just gardens and water supplies that were affected. People's health also began to suffer as well.
Yeah, that's right, because after weeks of relentless heat, hospitals started seeing increasing number of patients suffering from heat exhaustion, dehydration, and other heat-related illnesses, particularly the elderly or young children or people with existing health conditions. They were particularly vulnerable.
And obviously today we're used to hearing the heat health alerts on the news, telling people to stay hydrated, avoid the
Mm,
midday sun, and like check in on your elderly neighbours.
yeah,
And they always say that it's going to be the young and the elderly that are most affected by it.
yeah.
But back in '76, that sort of public health advice wasn't as common.
No, and Britain just wasn't prepared for prolonged periods of extreme heat, and the NHS found itself dealing with the consequences. So ambulance crews and hospital staff, they had to deal or cope with increasing numbers of patients, bearing in mind that hospitals wouldn't have had air conditioning either.
And
So
well, most wards still haven't today.
no, they have not. They have
I had
not.
to visit. I had to visit the hospital this week, and I sat in a little waiting area with air conditioning. It was lovely. I nearly fell asleep. Anyway, moving back to 1976 again. All of this must have made treating people particularly uncomfortable for everyone involved.
Yes, and as you said, even today, I mean, I can't speak for all hospitals, but our local hospital, that is true. Most of the wards do not have air conditioning, and having worked there myself during previous hot summers, I know it's really, really not pleasant. I'm talking about nurses passing out because it's that hot. Um, so it's just another reminder that although many people remember this summer with affection, for others, it was a very difficult and, in some cases, a very dangerous time.
Yeah, and it's also we bear in mind that, like we said earlier, people couldn't just retreat into an air conditioned shopping centre
No,
or jump into like a cool down car.
no. Most people just had to make the best of it. So, you'd throw your windows open, your curtains would stay closed when it was the hottest part of the day. That's what we're doing at the moment at home. Um, Electric fans were just selling out in shops, and people spent as much time outdoors as they could in the shade, or if they were lucky, headed to the coast, if they lived near enough to the coast, which we do actually, but our local beach is absolutely mobbed, so I haven't even attempted to venture down there, even on the
Yeah,
hottest
it's
days.
also it's also a bit of a dive in certain areas down there, so I happily avoid it. I would
Yeah,
also advise anyone who wants a fan, don't buy it in July and August. Buy it in October, November when they're cheaper and easier to get hold of in
yeah,
preparation for the summer.
yeah. I
But
think I
I
think that's sensible.
that's what I did. So bear in mind this current heat wave. It's not been that easy to sleep at night. So 1976 must have been quite a few sleepless nights.
Yes. I mean, houses in Britain were designed, I mean, I don't know about modern builds now, but I mean, our house is a 1970s house, and houses then were designed to keep heat in
Hmm.
during the
Yeah,
winter, not out during the summer. So after weeks and weeks of hot weather, many homes are becoming uncomfortably warm, especially at night.
yuck.
Yeah, that's the worst because you're hot and bothered all day and then you don't sleep at night. So it's just
Yeah.
awful. Um, so after these months and months of relentless sunshine, the obvious question is, when did it finally end?
Well, there is an answer, and it's almost too good to be true.
Yeah, it's quite funny actually. So by the end of August, the government decided the drought had become serious enough to appoint a dedicated minister for drought. And this man, or that man, was Dennis Howell. Howell, have I said that right?
Yeah, yeah.
I always want to say Howell, but it's Howell, isn't it? And
That'd be so well, wouldn't it? How?
his job was to help coordinate the country's response to the crisis.
Yep, and I seem to remember hearing that one of the things he did in the response to this was to do a rain dance, and then almost as soon as he'd been given the job, it rains.
Yeah, so his rain dance
He's done
worked
well, the boy.
because it wasn't just a quick shower. It was, I mean, many parts of the country experienced prolonged heavy rainfall, and the newspapers, as you can imagine, absolutely had a field day with this. They loved the irony.
You know, Dennis Howe, poor fella. He must have wondered what all the fuss was about.
Yeah, because despite the jokes, the rain was desperately needed and it brought an end to the long period of extreme heat. So, with the rain, temperatures gradually returned to something a bit more normal and the drought slowly began to ease.
But it wasn't quite as simple as that, was it?
No. Now, we did touch on this earlier, but basically, after months of baking in the sun, the ground had become so hard it couldn't absorb the sudden downpours. So, instead, much of the water just ran straight off the surface and we had floods. And I think I mentioned this earlier, but this was another challenge for farmers because the crops that they had that had actually survived the heat were now completely waterlogged and impossible to harvest. So, pretty devastating for them.
Yeah, it's incredible, really. You've gone from one state of affairs where people are worrying there isn't enough water to suddenly having too much.
Yeah. But despite that dramatic ending, the remarkable summer of 1976 had finally come to an end.
Yay.
But let's go back to the question we asked at the beginning of the episode. Was the
It's
summer
not.
of 1976 really Britain's hottest summer ever?
No, I've lost interest in it now. Let's not ask it.
Well, was it?
Well, I think you probably find it's one of those yes and no answers.
Yeah. I mean, for many years, 1976 did comfortably hold that title and it became the benchmark against which every other British heatwave was measured. You know, you can imagine the oldies going, well, oh, you should have been here in
Oh,
1976 and oh, it was
yeah.
worse than today. Yeah, you can imagine.
But yeah, your weather records don't stand still, though, do they? They sort of then we've seen some extraordinary summers ourselves.
We certainly have. I mean, the summers of 2003 springs to mind,
Yeah, yeah,
2018.
yeah,
Perhaps the most famous one, I remember this one, 2022. We were in Yorkshire and
yeah,
it was over 40 degrees.
yeah,
It was
yeah.
insane. Um, I don't think we left the house. Like we stayed in a cottage, and I don't think we left it for the entire 2 weeks we were there. Um, so they've all challenged or broken records that previously belonged to 1976. And in fact, the UK's highest ever recorded temperature, which according to what I found online, it was 40.3 degrees Celsius, but I've known it to be hotter than that,
Yes.
definitely.
Yeah, I
Um,
thought it was about
oh,
42.
this was 2022. I do
Yeah,
recall it in because yeah, like I said, we were in Yorkshire, and at one point it reached 45 while we were there,
yeah.
and it was crazy. Um, and do you know, I'll just say this quickly. I don't know how hot it was back home, but when we did come home, um, our garden, you probably remember this, our garden was covered in ash because there'd been so many wildfires in the surrounding parks. Do you remember this?
And yeah, I do remember some. Yeah,
Obviously, we missed all the fires because we were away, but when we came
yeah.
back, I remember that the garden just being full of ash because there'd been so many fires nearby and it had all just
And,
blown into the garden. Yeah, it's pretty
yeah,
scary actually.
a small field in Great Burstead had suddenly burst into flame, and the fire brigade had to turn out to
Yeah,
put it out.
yeah, and there were quite a few fires up at Wat Tyler as well. I think they had about 2 or 3 quite bad fires up there. That's where all the ash came from, I think. But
Yeah. So,
but yeah,
so if we've had hotter temperatures since then, why do
mm.
people still go on about the summer of '76 as the Great British Heatwave?
I think probably because it's not just about the highest temperature, it's probably more about how long it lasted and the impact it had. So
Mhm.
you think it's the 1970s. They've had week after week of hot, dry weather, which is placing enormous pressure on the country's water supplies, agriculture, transport, and public services, and they've got no rain on top of
Yeah.
that.
I
We've at least had
remember.
rain in between.
Yeah, I think we live in a commuter town, so thousands of people come from here up into the city on the
Mm,
trains.
mm,
Now, most of them are air conditioned,
yeah.
but then they would have been absolutely rammed, no air conditioning apart from
Oh,
being able to open a window.
do you know?
It must
I
have been terrible
remember.
when they were running.
I remember having to go to London. I don't even think it was a heat wave. I think it was just a regular warm summer. So it must have been about maybe 24, 25 degrees, which is positively cold at the moment when you compare to the heat we've been having. And I remember going down onto the underground, and I've never in my life experienced heat like that. And that wasn't even during a heat wave. That was just a normal summer. And
Yeah.
I was just shocked because as you know, I don't regularly use the train. This was just I think I had an appointment in London or something, and I had to get on the tube, and the heat was absolutely insane. I can see why they have to shut the tubes down when it gets this hot, because I think that
Oh,
people would literally cook.
yeah, I suppose when you think about it, 1976 wasn't just one incredibly hot afternoon.
No.
It was weeks and months, I suppose, of relentless sunshine with hardly any meaningful rain.
Yeah, and I think that's why many meteorologists, they still describe 1976 as Britain's Britain's greatest prolonged heat wave, with the
Like the fact you've
emphasis
got
being on
meteorologists right and struggled on
prolonged.
Brit. Yeah,
Yeah, mad. It's the heat, okay? It combined exceptional temperatures with one of the most severe droughts the country has ever experienced in modern times. In fact, there were some areas in the south which experienced temperatures exceeding 32 degrees Celsius. So, for any Americans that are listening, that's about 90 degrees Fahrenheit, for more than 2 weeks.
well,
I
so
mean, that's pretty
perhaps,
crazy.
yeah, perhaps it's fair to say that later summers may have been hotter for a day or two.
Yeah, but 1976 still remains the summer that changed the country. It's the one that people remember, or those of people that were old enough to remember. It's the one that future heat waves are still compared with, and it's the one that became part of British history.
Hence why the people still talk about it nearly 50 years later, or bang on 50 years later.
50 years later, yeah. I
Yeah.
mean, if you ask someone who lived through the summer of 1976, they probably won't tell you what the highest temperature was. They probably won't remember, but they'll remember the brown lawns, the packed beaches, the hose pipe bands, the smell of hot tarmac, and the feeling that the summer would never end. So,
Yeah.
after everything we've talked about, how did this legendary summer of 1976 actually change Britain?
Well, in the short term, there were some very obvious consequences.
Mm.
Farmers had lost huge amounts of crops,
Mm-hmm.
which inevitably pushed up food prices, and
Yeah,
many businesses had also been affected by the drought.
yeah, and yeah, that's true. And perhaps the biggest impact though wasn't immediate, but um it did show us just how vulnerable Britain could be to prolonged periods of hot, dry weather.
Before then, I don't think many people had really imagined that Britain could experience a drought on that scale.
No, because you associate, even now people do, but back then particularly, everybody associates. I don't know what's wrong with my words today. Everyone associates England with rain.
Yeah,
So, water companies and the government, it forced them to take a good, long, hard look at how the country's water supplies were managed. So, reservoir planning was improved, drought contingent. I'm going to give up in a minute. Contingency, you know what I'm trying to say.
contingency plans.
That word became far
Contingency
more
plans.
sophisticated, and there was much greater emphasis on conserving water before it became critical.
Yeah, it also changed the way scientists and meteorologists thought about extreme weather.
Yeah,
So the summer of 1976 become the benchmark
yeah,
case
it
study
did.
that would be referred to time and time again whenever another major heat wave arrived.
Yeah, And in many ways, it still is. Every time Britain experiences another spell of
Yeah.
exceptionally hot weather, which it is right now, comparisons with 1976 are never far behind.
It's almost become part of our national memory. Mention the
Yeah.
summer of 76 to someone who lived through it, and they'll probably have a story to tell you.
Yep, whether it's memories of brown lawns or packed beaches or hosepipe bands or melting roads, it's a summer that left its mark, not just on the landscape, but on the people that experienced it.
So, was it Britain's hottest ever summer?
Maybe not by every modern measurement, but if you ask the people who lived through it, they'll probably tell you that no other summer has ever quite compared. Thank you for listening, everybody.